Book the Third, Chapter 4 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Storm. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the Third, Chapter 4, Ellen at Bay. 2 o'clock came, and Pedgift Junior, punctual to his time, came with it. His vivacity of the morning had all sparkled out. He greeted Ellen with his customary politeness, but without his customary smile, and when the head waiter came in for orders, his dismissal was instantly pronounced in words never yet heard to issue from the lips of Pedgift in that hotel. "Nothing at present." "You seem to be in low spirits," said Ellen. "Can't we get our information? Can nobody tell you anything about the house in Pimlico?" "3 different people have told me about it, Mr. Armadale, and they have all 3 said the same thing." Allan eagerly drew his chair nearer to the place occupied by his travelling companion. His reflections in the interval since they had last seen each other had not tended to compose him. That strange connection, so easy to feel, so hard to trace, between the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's family circumstances and the difficulty of approaching Miss Gwilt's reference, which had already established itself in his thoughts, had by this time stealthily taken a firmer and firmer hold on his mind. Doubts troubled him which he could neither understand nor express. Curiosity filled him which he half longed and half dreaded to satisfy. "I'm afraid I must trouble you with a question or two, sir, before I can come to the point," said Pedgift Junior. "I don't want to force myself into your confidence. I only want to see my way in what looks to me like a very awkward business. Do you mind telling me whether others besides yourself are interested in this inquiry of ours?" "Other people are interested in it," replied Allan. "There's no objection to telling you that." "Is there any other person who is the object of the inquiry besides Mrs. Mandeville herself?" pursued Pedgift, winding his way a little deeper into the secret. "Yes, there is another person," said Allan, answering rather unwillingly. "Is the person a young woman, Mr. Armadale?" Allan started. "How do you come to guess that?" he began, then checked himself when it was too late. "Don't ask me any more questions," he resumed. "I'm a bad hand at defending myself against a sharp fellow like you, and I'm bound in honor toward other people to keep the particulars of this business to myself." Pedgift Junior had apparently heard enough for his purpose. He drew his chair, in his turn, nearer to Allan. He was evidently anxious and embarrassed, but his professional manner began to show itself again from sheer force of habit. "I've done with my questions, sir," he said, "and I have something to say now on my side. In my father's absence, perhaps you may be kindly disposed to consider me as your legal adviser. If you will take my advice, you will not stir another step in this inquiry." "What do you mean?" interposed Allan. "It is just possible, Mr. Armadale, that the cabman, positive as he is, may have been mistaken. I strongly recommend you to take it for granted that he is mistaken, and to drop it there." The caution was kindly intended, but it came too late. Allan did what 99 men out of 100 in his position would have done. He declined to take his lawyer's advice. "Very well, sir," said Pedgift Junior. "If you will have it, you must have it." He leaned forward close to Allan's ear, and whispered what he had heard of the house in Pimlico, and of the people who occupied it. "Don't blame me, Mr. Armadale," he added, when the irrevocable words had been spoken. "I tried to spare you." Allan suffered the shock, as all great shocks are suffered, in silence. His first impulse would have driven him headlong for refuge to that very view of the cabman's assertion which had just been recommended to him, but for one damning circumstance which placed itself inexorably in his way. Miss Gwilt's marked reluctance to approach the story of her past life rose irrepressibly on his memory, in indirect but horrible confirmation of the evidence which connected Miss Gwilt's reference with the house in Pimlico. One conclusion, and one only, the conclusion which any man must have drawn, hearing what he had just heard, and knowing no more than he knew, forced itself into his mind. A miserable fallen woman, who had abandoned herself in her extremity to the help of wretches skilled in criminal concealment, who had stolen her way back to decent society and a reputable employment by means of a false character, and whose position now imposed on her the dreadful necessity of perpetual secrecy and perpetual deceit in relation to her past life. Such was the aspect in which the beautiful governess at Thorpe Ambrose now stood revealed to Allan's eyes. Falsely revealed or truly revealed? Had she stolen her way back to decent society and a reputable employment by means of a false character? She had. Did her position impose on her the dreadful necessity of perpetual secrecy and perpetual deceit in relation to her past life? It did. Was she some such pitiable victim to the treachery of a man unknown as Allan had supposed? She was no such pitiable victim. The conclusion which Allan had drawn, the conclusion literally forced into his mind by the facts before him, was nevertheless the conclusion of all others that was furthest even from touching on the truth. The true story of Miss Gwilt's connection with the house in Pimlico and the people who inhabited it, a house rightly described as filled with wicked secrets and people rightly represented as perpetually in danger of feeling the grasp of the law, was a story which coming events were yet to disclose, a story infinitely less revolting and yet infinitely more terrible than Allan or Allan's companion had either of them supposed. "I tried to spare you, Mr. Armadale," repeated Pedgift. "I was anxious, if I could possibly avoid it, not to distress you." Allan looked up, and made an effort to control himself. "You have distressed me dreadfully," he said. "You have quite crushed me down, but it is not your fault. I ought to feel you have done me a service, and what I ought to do I will do, when I am my own man again. There is one thing," Allan added, after a moment's painful consideration, "which ought to be understood between us at once. The advice you offered me just now was very kindly meant, and it was the best advice that could be given. I will take it gratefully. We will never talk of this again, if you please, and I beg and entreat you will never speak about it to any other person. Will you promise me that?" Pedgift gave the promise with very evident sincerity, but without his professional confidence of manner. The distress in Allan's face seemed to daunt him. After a moment of very uncharacteristic hesitation, he considerately quitted the room. Left by himself, Allan rang for writing materials, and took out of his pocket-book the fatal letter of introduction to Mrs. Mandeville, which he had received from the major's wife. A man accustomed to consider consequences, and to prepare himself for action by previous thought, would, in Allan's present circumstances, have felt some difficulty as to the course which it might now be least embarrassing and least dangerous to pursue. Accustomed to let his impulses direct him on all other occasions, Allan acted on impulse in the serious emergency that now confronted him. Though his attachment to Miss Gwilt was nothing like the deeply rooted feeling which he had himself honestly believed it to be, she had taken no common place in his admiration, and she filled him with no common grief when he thought of her now. His one dominant desire, at that critical moment in his life, was a man's merciful desire to protect from exposure and ruin the unhappy woman who had lost her place in his estimation, without losing her claim to the forbearance that could spare, and to the compassion that could shield her. "I can't go back to Thorpe Ambrose. I can't trust myself to speak to her or to see her again, but I can keep her miserable secret, and I will." With that thought in his heart, Allan set himself to perform the first and foremost duty which now claimed him, the duty of communicating with Mrs. Milroy. If he had possessed a higher mental capacity and a clearer mental view, he might have found the letter no easy one to write. As it was, he calculated no consequences, and felt no difficulty. His instinct warned him to withdraw at once from the position in which he now stood toward the major's wife, and he wrote what his instinct counselled him to write under those circumstances, as rapidly as the pen could travel over the paper. "Dunn's Hotel, Covent Garden, Tuesday. "Dear Madam,